Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to be unpacking a seriously fascinating thesis. We're looking at the ancient sociological and biblical roots behind some of the most complex geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East today. We're investigating a dynamic that our sources call the chosen younger brother. Now, you might be wondering, why has this specific conflict endured for millennia? I mean, how does an animosity survive the complete collapse of the ancient empires that originally birthed it? It's a pretty compelling hook, right? And our sources offer a deeply structural answer that bridges ancient theology, sociology, and modern history. So let's dive right in. Here is our roadmap. We'll move through four key areas. First, the global scapegoat. Second, the biblical blueprint. Third, Islam and unification. And finally, the modern fusion. Section 1. The global scapegoat, the sociological baseline. Our sources point to this unique, completely unbroken thread of prejudice. But here's the thing, hostility toward Jewish populations didn't just stay static. It actually morphed to fit the spirit of the times. In the ancient world, the conflict was largely cultural and political, clashing with pagan empires. Fast forward to the medieval era, and it shifted into theological anti-Judaism and forced conversions. Then, in the modern era, it mutated again, this time into pseudo-scientific racial and conspiracy theories. It's exactly the same underlying hostility, just wearing the mask of whatever era it happens to find itself in. So what actually locked this dynamic into place? Well, the text points directly to the diaspora. This is the structural reality of existing as a permanent, distinct minority living inside other nations without sovereign protection, which was triggered largely by the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Sociologists identified this exact combination, minoritarian distinctiveness plus vulnerability, as the absolute perfect recipe for becoming a global scapegoat. When dominant cultures faced massive catastrophes they literally couldn't control, they reflexively blamed this vulnerable minority. Take the Black Death in the mid-1300s, for example. Jewish communities were violently scapegoated for poisoning wells, simply because people completely lacked any understanding of germ theory. Or during economic collapses, rulers would just scapegoat them as a convenient excuse to erase debts and seize assets. Essentially, they became a blank canvas for society's own fears and failures. Section 2. The biblical blueprint, the ancient roots. Now, the ancient texts reveal a really fascinating repeating pattern, the total inversion of human hierarchy. Naturally, you'd think the firstborn elder holds the power, but God consistently chooses the younger brother. Cain and Abel, that led to murder in the field. Ishmael and Isaac resulted in multi-generational border friction. Esau and Jacob sparked a plotted murder, and those 10 older brothers sold Joseph into slavery. The crucial takeaway here is that this sovereign choice consistently sparked intense, violent resentment from the not-chosen older brother. To see exactly when this whole scapegoat dynamic locked into place, let's contrast Abraham with Isaac. Abraham was a nomadic power broker. He had his own army, he was respected by local kings, he was an outsider, sure, but he was way too powerful to be bullied. Isaac, on the other hand, was a settled farmer. He planted crops, competed locally, and prospered. According to the text, this distinct, localized success is what triggered intense economic jealousy, vandalism, and eventually state-ordered exile. Listen to what King Abimelech tells Isaac in Genesis 26. "Move away from us, for you have become much too powerful for us." As the source material points out, this is the exact biblical blueprint for the medieval economic expulsions we just talked about. The moment the distinct minority succeeds on the dominant culture's turf, they're immediately targeted as a threat and driven out. Connecting the micro to the macro, we arrive at what the text calls the scapegoat burden. The chosen younger brother is structurally forced to carry the sins, failures, and anxieties of the dominant culture. These individual biblical stories actually scale up to represent vast, global geopolitical realities that Israel has faced over the millennia. It's like a giant puzzle coming together. Section 3. Islam and unification. The militarized feud and ancient birthright dispute. We start with another foundational text, Genesis 16:12, prophesying about Ishmael. "He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." Now, the source analyzes this not as an insult, but as a vivid description of a fiercely independent, untamable warrior culture. It's literally a prophecy of perpetual internal and external friction. For centuries, the source notes, Ishmael's descendants were fragmented warring clans. Think of it in terms of fuel and an engine. The latent, fragmented tribal identities and ancient bloodlines of Ishmael and Arabia acted as the fuel. But in 622 CE, Islam became the engine. It provided the ideological, military, and political unification that forged them into a single, unified civilization capable of mass expansion. According to the source material, this massive unification systemically reawakened the ancient feud. First, it resurrected the birthright, claiming Ishmael, not Isaac, was the true son of promise. Second, it centered geography, shifting the ultimate holy site from Jerusalem all the way down to Mecca. And third, it created an administrative hostility, dividing the entire world into Dar al-Islam, the house of submission, and Dar al-Harb, the house of war. I want you to hold this number in your mind for just a moment. 150,000. Historians estimate this as the maximum number of casualties in the entire Arab-Israeli conflict, over nearly 80 years. It is a tragic number, absolutely, but the source material uses it to set up a very stark contrast for what we're looking at next. Because when we look at major internal conflicts in the region, the data tells a striking story about that ancient prophecy of internal friction. Just to put that into perspective, the Iran-Iraq War saw an estimated 1 million casualties. The Syrian Civil War, 600,000. The Yemeni Civil War, 377,000. This powerfully illustrates the source's point that intense internal friction, hostility toward his own brothers, drastically outweighs the external conflicts with Israel. Section 4. The Modern Fusion, 20th Century Politics. Let's clarify a really crucial distinction made in the sources here: myth versus reality. It is a total myth that the Arab-Israeli conflict is an unbroken 4,000-year religious war. The reality is that it's largely a modern political manufacture. Actually, the texts note that Jews and Arabs coexisted relatively peacefully for centuries under Islamic rule during the Middle Ages. So where on earth does the intense modern hatred come from? Well, the source breaks it down into a 20th century equation. You take latent 7th century Islamic polemics, add a very real modern land and nationalist conflict following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and then mix in imported 20th century European conspiracy theories. The result? Modern Islamist anti-Semitism. It's a highly volatile hybrid of ancient theology, land disputes, and imported propaganda. This is where religion was strategically weaponized. In the 1930s and 40s, political leaders intentionally merged European anti-Semitic propaganda and Nazi alliances right alongside those ancient local texts. They retrofitted the stories of Isaac and Ishmael to mobilize populations for a modern border war, effectively pulling an ancient rivalry out of the past and completely turning it into a modern propaganda tool. A real game changer in the worst way. Summarizing the thesis, the source describes an unbroken circle of friction. There's friction within, perpetual infighting, tribal wars, and the Sunni-Shia split. And then there's friction without, confrontation with the line of Isaac in the west. The text argues that without an external adversary, the region defaults right back to internal infighting, matching the ancient prophecy of a culture propelled by the tension of the not-chosen elder brother absolutely perfectly. Which leaves us with a profound question to ponder as we wrap up. If this geopolitical conflict is deeply rooted in an ancient, spiritual sibling rivalry, a dynamic older than the nations fighting it, can modern political treaties ever truly resolve it? It's a provocative thought from our sources that definitely reframes how we look at the headlines. Thanks for joining me as we unpacked this explainer today.